Who the hell let this dirty black beggar into my factory?
Wade Prescott, chief engineer, corner office, didn't whisper it. He announced it. 30 workers on the mezzanine turned to watch.
Smells like a sewer pipe dressed like a dumpster fire.
He stepped closer.
This is a $100 million facility, not a homeless shelter.
Laughter in waves. One worker sprayed air freshener. Another whistled like calling a stray. Someone hollered,
"Which trash can did you crawl out of?"
The man stood still, oil-black hands gripping a battered red toolbox. He said, barely above a whisper,
"I'm just the mechanic called to look at the turbine."
Mechanic?
Wade turned to his
A
audience.
dirty black mechanic. Thinks he's gonna fix what my whole team couldn't.
Every factory worker laughed. 30 men, one sound. None of them knew that minutes before a $100 million shutdown, this dirty black mechanic would fix what no one else could. His name was Desmond Monroe. Des. 42 years old, black, freelance industrial mechanic. And everything Wade said about him, the smell, the clothes, the poverty, was technically true. That was the cruelest part. The insults landed because they had somewhere to land. He was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows, wrists like bundled wire. His Carhartt coveralls were 8 years old, patched at the knees with duct tape, collar frayed to loose threads. His steel-toed boots were held at the ankle by baling wire. The zipper broke 4 months ago. A new pair cost $60. He didn't have $60. He didn't have 6. His hands were the darkest part of him, not from birth, but from 25 years of bare-knuckle labor. Oil and grease had worked so deep into the cracks of his skin that no soap could reach it anymore. The workers saw filth. What they were actually looking at was a quarter-century resume written in calluses and carbon. Every scar was a machine saved. Every stain was someone else's emergency that Des had answered when no one else would. 2 years ago, his wife Ruth died of pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. She died on a Wednesday. Des was holding her hand. Maya was holding the other. The hospital room cost more per night than Des earned in a week, and the bills began arriving before the flowers had wilted. Because he was freelance, no employer, no union, no insurance, the debt fell on him alone, like a roof collapsing. He sold their house in Wilkinsburg, sold Ruth's Honda, sold the furniture, sold her grandmother's ring, the one Ruth had said should go to Maya on her wedding day. When everything was gone, he still owed $184,000. Now, Desmond Monroe lived in a 1998 Ford E250 van behind Kowalski's scrapyard, 3 miles from this mill. Back seat ripped out, foam mattress, army blanket, clothes on a rope. A milk crate held canned beans, instant rice, and a jar of peanut butter that had been empty for 3 days. He ate once a day, sometimes less. On bad weeks, he drank water from the scrapyard hose and told himself it was fasting, not starving. Every dollar went to 2 places, the hospital debt and a dormitory at Carnegie Mellon, where his 19-year-old daughter Maya studied mechanical engineering on a partial scholarship. Maya believed her father rented a small room near the yard. She had never seen the van. When she video called, Des propped his phone on a napkin dispenser at a 24-hour diner and pretended he was home. He always made sure to call during the dinner rush, so the background noise sounded like a living room with a television on. This morning, he had counted quarters on the dashboard. $11. Exactly enough for a round trip. If this job didn't pay, he was stranded. He touched the St. Barbara medallion welded to the toolbox lid, patron saint of miners and metal workers. It had belonged to his father, Howard Monroe, a steel worker at this very mill who died of black lung when Des was 15. The morning Howard died, he had gripped Des's hand and said one thing. "Don't let the machines go quiet, son. Des had kept that promise for 27 years. This toolbox was the only inheritance he received, the only thing he never sold. Not when the debt collectors called, not when the gas tank hit empty, not once. Now he was standing in his dead father's mill, holding his dead father's tools, while 30 men laughed at him for looking like what he was, a man who had lost everything except the ability to fix things other people couldn't. Janet Moore appeared, plant manager, 48, sharp-eyed, the first woman to ever run a facility in the company's history. She had found Des through a niche online forum where retired mechanics traded case studies on obsolete German turbines. Her own engineering department, Wade's department, had spent 3 weeks failing to diagnose a worsening vibration in the plant's master turbine. A 40-year-old, irreplaceable German-built unit that powered the entire rolling line. 3 weeks. 4 outside consultants. 0 answers. Janet pushed past Wade without a glance, handed Des a thin manila folder, the turbine's service log. 2 words. "Show me." Des opened it, flipped past 5 pages of routine entries, reached page 6. His finger stopped. Eyes narrowed. He read the entry once, again. His lips shaped a word no one caught. Interesting. He closed the folder, touched the medallion, opened the toolbox. Wade leaned to his deputy. $20 says he quits inside the hour. The deputy took the bet. What neither of them knew was that Des had just found something on page 6, a single parts requisition entry that every certified engineer in this building had walked past for 5 months. And what that entry said was going to end Wade Prescott's career. Des descended the metal staircase into the turbine bay alone. The air down here was different, hot, dense, vibrating with a low hum that you didn't hear so much as feel in your teeth. The master turbine sat at the center of the bay like a sleeping giant, encased in scarred steel plating, bolted to a concrete pad that had cracked in 3 places from decades of relentless rotation. This machine was older than most of the men upstairs. It was also the only reason any of them had jobs. Des placed his palm flat on the turbine casing, closed his eyes, felt the vibration travel through his bones. Not just the normal hum, but something underneath it. A stutter. A rhythm that shouldn't be there, like a heart skipping every 4th beat. He had felt this before. Twice in 30 years. Both times the machine was dying and nobody knew it. He opened his eyes. He knew. Then the alarm scream. Red strobes erupted across the bay. The overhead display flashed. Bearing temperature, critical. Within seconds, the control room upstairs was chaos. Phones ringing, engineers shouting over each other, and on the main screen, a video call connecting to corporate headquarters in Cleveland. Richard Cole appeared on screen. VP of Operations, gray suit, gray hair, gray patience. 60 minutes, Cole said. No greeting, no context, just the number. Stabilize that turbine in 60 minutes or I'm authorizing a full emergency shutdown. The room understood what that meant. Every person who had worked in a steel mill for more than a year understood what that meant. Shutting down the turbine meant cooling the blast furnace. Cooling the blast furnace meant destroying its refractory lining, a structure that took 14 months and $100 million to rebuild. It meant 1,200 workers sent home, pensions frozen, mortgages defaulted, families broken. The same 30 men who had just laughed at the dirty black mechanic would be standing in an unemployment line by Christmas. Wade's engineers scrambled. They pulled up schematics, ran diagnostics, argued with each other in voices that got louder as answers got scarcer. But they had nothing. 3 weeks of trying had given them nothing. And now they had 60 minutes to find what 3 weeks couldn't. Janet stood at the back of the control room. She watched Wade bark orders that went nowhere. She watched his team chase the same dead ends they'd been chasing for 21 days. Then she looked at the monitor showing the turbine bay. There was Des, alone, one hand on the machine, listening. She walked down. Des looked up. His face held no panic, no urgency, just the quiet certainty of a man who had already found the answer and was waiting for someone to ask. "I know what's wrong," he said, "but you're not going to like it." 59 minutes. The clock on the wall had started counting. And the only man with a diagnosis was the one the entire building wanted gone. "It's the coupling collar," Des said. He spoke the way a surgeon speaks before cutting, calm, precise, no wasted words. "Misaligned, installed wrong, and the parts are cheap, rated way below what this shaft needs." Janet stared at him. "How do you know?" Des held up the service log, page 6. He pointed to a single line entry, a parts requisition dated 5 months ago. Chengdu HX40 coupling collar, rated 3,000 revolutions per minute. He tapped the turbine casing. "This shaft runs 3,450. Whoever approved this knew it was under spec. Or didn't care." Janet's jaw tightened. She knew who approved parts requisitions. Everyone did. Wade Prescott. But that revelation could wait. The clock couldn't. "What do you need?" Janet asked. 2 floor guys to help me brace the housing, a clear path to the coupling assembly, and everyone else out of my way." Janet nodded. She sent 2 technicians down, Eddie Burke and a younger man named Travis. Des got to work immediately. He opened the red toolbox with the reverence of a priest opening a tabernacle. Every tool inside had a place. Every place had a purpose. Nothing was new. Every piece was worn, repaired, older than some of the apprentices upstairs, but everything was immaculate. The chaos of Des's life stopped at the lid of this toolbox. Inside, there was order. Inside, there was his father. He selected a torque wrench, a dial indicator, and a stethoscope-like instrument with a long metal probe, a contact vibration analyzer that most modern mechanics had never seen, because most modern mechanics didn't need to listen to machines the way Des did. They had software. They had sensors. Des had his hands and 30 years of listening to metal speak. He placed the probe on 4 points of the turbine casing. 1, 2, 3, 4. At each point, he closed his eyes and tilted his head, the way a musician tunes an instrument by ear. Then he connected the probe to a handheld oscilloscope, a battered device held together with electrical tape, and turned the screen toward Janet. "See that frequency pattern? That's coupling misalignment, not bearing failure. Wade's team said it was the bearings. Wade's team was wrong." He said it without arrogance, without satisfaction. Just fact. The way you say the sky is blue. Upstairs, the oscilloscope reading was projected onto the control room monitor. Wade watched it from behind the glass. His face changed. Not to embarrassment, not yet, but to something worse. Fear. Because if the coupling was the problem, then the parts requisition was the cause, and the parts requisition had his signature. Wade picked up his radio. "Eddie, Travis, report to fire watch stations immediately. That's a direct order." Eddie looked at Des. Des was elbow deep in the turbine housing, fingers working a seized bolt. "We're assisting the contractor." "Fire watch, now! That's not a request." Eddie hesitated, looked at Des. Des didn't look back. He just kept working, his jaw set, his hands steady. Eddie left. Travis followed. Just like that, Des was alone. The 2 men Wade sent to help, The only two hands Des had were pulled away on a fabricated order. Firewatch was protocol during hot work, but there was no hot work happening anywhere else in the plant. Wade invented a reason to isolate the one person who could save the building, because saving the building meant exposing Wade. And Wade would rather watch 1,200 people lose their jobs than watch one man prove him wrong. Des didn't protest. He didn't call Janet. He didn't waste a single second on politics. He simply adjusted. He braced the housing plate with his boot, used his left hand as a lever, and continued working the seized bolt with his right. Alone. The way he had done everything for the past 2 years. Alone. 51 minutes left. He needed to hear Maya's voice, not for comfort, for data. The coupling's original torque specifications were in German, published in a 1981 Kreutzer Energie technical manual that existed in exactly 3 places: the manufacturer's archive in Stuttgart, a retired engineer's bookshelf in Dusseldorf, and a PDF that Maya had found 2 years ago during a research project and bookmarked on her laptop. Des pulled out his phone. The screen read 3%. No charger. His had broken last week, and a replacement cost $12 he didn't have. $12. The price of a charging cable was the distance between saving this plant and failing it. He called Maya. She picked up on the second ring. Dad? I'm between classes. What's? I need the Kreutzer HX spec sheet, the 81 manual, coupling torque values for the 3450 series. A pause, then the sound of a laptop opening. Maya didn't ask why. She didn't ask where or how or what's going on. She knew her father's voice, the one that meant, this matters, right now. She had heard it the night her mother's monitors started beeping wrong. She had heard it the morning Des told her the house was sold. She heard it now. Keys clicking. Got it. Page 44. Primary coupling torque 340 Newton meters. Secondary seat 280. Axial play tolerance 0.05 millimeters. Read them again. Slower. She did. Des repeated each number under his breath as he worked, his fingers translating data into motion with the seamless fluency of a man who thought in metal. The phone sat on the turbine housing, speaker crackling, Maya's voice the only human sound in the bay. The battery dropped to 2%. Pete Holloway saw it. Pete was 58, a welder, 30 years on this floor. He had been on the mezzanine when Des walked in. He hadn't sprayed air freshener. He hadn't hollered from the railing. But he had chuckled. He had stood in that crowd and let his silence become part of the laughter. He had watched a man be humiliated and done nothing, because doing nothing was easy, and 30 years of doing nothing had become a habit that felt like survival. But now Pete was watching something that made his habit feel like cowardice. A starving man, working alone, trying to save every job in this building, including Pete's, with a dying phone and 2 hands that the whole floor had called dirty. Pete walked to the break room, came back with a charger, plugged it in next to Des without a word. Then he picked up a rig light, a heavy, battery-powered work lamp, and held it over Des's workspace. Steady, silent. His hands were shaking slightly, but his grip was firm. No one asked him to do any of this. Des looked up. Their eyes met. Des nodded once. Pete nodded back. That was the whole conversation. 2 men, 1 nod. More said in that silence than in all the laughter on the mezzanine. The air freshener guy, his name was Colton, drifted down from the mezzanine. He didn't offer help, he just stood at the edge of the bay, arms crossed, watching. Then another worker came. Then 2 more. The mocking crowd was becoming an audience. The laughter was becoming silence. And the silence was becoming something that felt, for the first time, like respect. 42 minutes left. Temperature gauge climbing. The turbines bearing heat had entered the amber zone, not yet critical, but trending toward it with the slow certainty of a fever that won't break. Des removed the coupling collar. What he found underneath stopped him cold. The cheap Chengdu collar hadn't just misaligned, it had scored the turbine shaft. Deep grooves cut into hardened steel by months of off-axis vibration. Even if Des replaced the collar with a perfect part, those grooves would destroy any new shim within hours. The shaft itself was damaged. The problem wasn't just the part, it was what the part had done to the machine. The official repair procedure for a scored turbine shaft required a full shutdown, a crane extraction, and 6 weeks in a machine shop. Des had 38 minutes. There was one other option: micro-welding, laying tiny beads of filler metal into the grooves while the shaft continued to spin at 200 revolutions per minute, smoothing the surface without stopping the machine. It was a technique that existed in theory, in old textbooks, and in the hands of maybe a dozen people on Earth. The safety manual said it couldn't be done without shutdown. The safety manual had never met Howard Monroe. Des reached into the bottom of the red toolbox. Hidden beneath a false panel was a compartment his father had built, a space just large enough for one tool. He lifted it out. A TIG welding torch, hand-bent at a precise 22-degree angle, wrapped in leather at the grip. Howard Monroe had fabricated it 40 years ago in a garage that didn't have electricity, running the welder off a car battery and a prayer. Des held it the way you hold something holy, the way you hold the last thing your father ever made. "Dad always said the machine will talk to you," he murmured. "You just gotta be quiet enough to listen." His hands were trembling, not from fear, from hunger. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, a half portion of rice and canned beans that he'd split into 2 servings and only eaten 1. The other half was still in the van, saved for tonight. If there was a tonight. He gripped the turbine casing with one hand, breathed through his nose, steadied himself. Fired the torch. Blue light filled the bay. Then the overhead lights flickered, once, twice, and the hum of the entire plant shifted down half a tone. The power grid was starting to buckle. 22 minutes left. The temperature gauge had crossed into amber and was flirting with red. Des was welding millimeter beads into the shaft grooves, his face inches from metal spinning fast enough to kill him when the staircase behind him rang with boots. 2 security guards, company badges, hands on their belts. Behind them, Wade Prescott. "That man is unauthorized personnel in a hazardous zone," Wade said. He was speaking to the guards, but his voice was pitched for the entire floor. "Remove him. Now." The guards stepped forward. Pete shifted the rig light, but didn't put it down. The workers who had gathered at the edge of the bay went rigid. Even the turbine seemed to hold its breath, though that was just the vibration cycling through another skip. Des turned off the torch, set it down gently on the toolbox, the way you set down something you might need again very soon. Then he stood up, slowly. He was taller than Wade by 3 inches, but thinner by 40 pounds. The coveralls hung off his frame like a flag on a windless day. His face was streaked with sweat and carbon. His eyes were perfectly still. He looked at Wade, not with anger, not with pleading, with the calm of a man who had buried his wife, lost his home, and eaten 1 meal a day for 2 years. A man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. A man who had nothing left to lose except the truth. And the truth was on page 6. "You used Chengdu couplings," Des said, quiet, almost gentle. "Rated 3,000 revolutions per minute on a shaft that runs 3,450. Wade's smirk cracked, just barely. "You don't know what you're—" "Page 6. Des didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the bay did the work for him. You signed the purchase order yourself, 5 months ago. I saw it before anyone even called the alarm. Silence. Total. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses on your chest and makes you aware of your own breathing. Every worker on that floor turned to Wade, the guy who sprayed air freshener, the guy who hollered about the trash can. Colton, who had drifted down from the mezzanine, Pete, still holding the rig light, all of them, looking at Wade now the way they had looked at Dez an hour ago. Except this time, there was no laughter, because Dez wasn't finished. Those couplings cost 60% less than OEM. The price difference on a bulk order that size? About $40,000. Dez paused, let the number settle into the room like a stone sinking through water. Funny how the supplier is a company nobody's heard of. Funnier how the money went somewhere the books don't show. Wade's face went white. Not embarrassed white, caught white. The color of a man watching his own signature become evidence. The revelation reframed everything. This wasn't a turbine malfunction. This was a cover-up. Wade had purchased under-spec parts, pocketed the difference through a kickback arrangement with a discount supplier, and buried the paper trail for 5 months. The vibration, the bearing heat, the $100 million threat, the 1,200 jobs hanging by a thread. All of it traced back to one man's greed and one purchase order on page 6. Janet Moore stepped between the security guards and Dez. She removed her glasses, put them back on. Her tell, every worker knew it. The sign that something irreversible was about to happen. Wade? Her voice was flat as a blade. You're done here. Don't touch anything. Wade opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the guards. The guards looked at Janet. Janet outranked him. She outranked everyone in this building except Richard Cole, and Richard Cole was watching on a screen from Cleveland with an expression that suggested Wade Prescott had already been fired. The paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. Wade retreated to the control room, clipboard still in his hand. The clipboard he'd carried for 28 years like a scepter, suddenly looking like what it always was. A prop. A costume piece. The scepter of a king who never had a kingdom. On the floor, no one moved. The worker who had first called Dez a dirty black mechanic was staring at his own boots as if the answer to every wrong choice he'd ever made was written on the concrete. Colton muttered, barely audible, "We were clowning the only guy who knows what's wrong." Pete said it plainest, said it loud enough for everyone. That man's trying to save our jobs, and we stood there laughing at him. The moral inversion was complete. The dirtiest-looking man on the floor was the only clean person in the building. Dez bent down, picked up his father's torch. His hands were shaking, worse than before. Not hunger now, not fear. Something older. Something that felt like every time he had been looked at the way Wade looked at him, every time he had lowered his eyes and tightened his grip and waited, all of it rising to the surface at once like a bruise that finally reaches the skin. He breathed, gripped the torch, and got back to work. Because the clock Wade stole hadn't stopped, and there were only 14 minutes left. 14 minutes. That was what Wade's sabotage had left him. Out of 60, Dez had spent the first 15 being mocked, the next 20 working alone after Wade pulled his assistants, and another 11 being interrupted by security guards and exposing a fraud he hadn't come here to expose. 14 minutes to do what the safety manual said was impossible without a full shutdown. Micro-weld a spinning shaft, re-machine a shim, reseat the coupling, save the plant. Dez didn't think about the math. He thought about the metal. He lowered himself back into the turbine housing, torch in hand. The shaft was spinning at 200 revolutions per minute, not fast enough to blur, but fast enough to kill. One slip, one catch of a sleeve or a finger, and the rotation would pull him in like a lathe pulls a rag. There would be no second chance. There would barely be a sound. Pete held the rig light. His hands were trembling too, but his grip was iron. He positioned the beam exactly where Des needed it, 2 inches above the scoring on the shaft, angled to eliminate shadow. 30 years of welding had taught Pete where light mattered. This was the last and best thing his experience could offer, and he offered it without a word. Maya was still on the phone. She had gone silent, no more specs to read. She was just listening to the hiss of the torch, the hum of the shaft, the rhythm of her father's breathing. She didn't know he was starving. She didn't know he was homeless. She didn't know that the man on the other end of the line was performing surgery on a spinning steel shaft with a handmade torch in a building full of people who had mocked him for existing. All she knew was that her father was working, and that when he worked, you stayed quiet and you stayed close. Ruth had taught her that. Ruth had always known. Des fired the torch. The blue arc kissed the shaft. He welded by feel, not by sight, by vibration. His left hand rested flat on the turbine casing, reading the frequency through his fingertips the way a blind man reads Braille. His right hand held the torch at his father's angle, 22 degrees, the bend that Howard Monroe had calculated on a napkin in 1979 and never written down anywhere else. When the weld puddle was right, the metal sang, a faint, high harmonic, almost inaudible under the machinery roar that told Des the filler was bonding, the groove was filling, the shaft was healing. "The machine will talk to you," his father used to say. "You just got to be quiet enough to listen." Des listened. The metal sang. Bead by bead, groove by groove, the shaft smoothed. 8 minutes left. A wave of dizziness rolled through him. His vision blurred at the edges, his knees softened. Hunger. The body reminding him that it was running on nothing. He gripped the casing, locked his elbow, and breathed through his nose until the world stopped tilting. Pete saw it. Pete adjusted the light to reduce the glare on Des's eyes, a tiny gesture, the kind that only a welder would think of. Then Des kept welding. 6 minutes. The shaft was clean. He killed the torch, pulled himself out of the housing, and sprinted, actually sprinted, his wire-tied boots slapping the concrete, out the bay door, through the corridor, past the mezzanine where 30 men had laughed at him a lifetime ago, and into the parking lot where his van was parked. The portable lathe was in the back, wedged between the mattress and the milk crate. He hauled it out, ran back in, clamped it to the workbench, and began remachining the shim. The shim had to be perfect. Not close, not good enough. Perfect. A tolerance of 5/100ths of a millimeter, the width of a human hair. Anything more and the vibration would return within hours. Des turned the lathe by hand for the rough cut, then switched to a file for the final thousandths. His oil-black fingers moved with a precision that no machine in the building could match. Because machines follow programs. Des followed instinct. Decades of it. Built one broken engine at a time in parking lots and scrap yards and garages that smelled like his father's. 4 minutes. He was back at the turbine, coupling collar in one hand, shim in the other. He seated the collar over the repaired shaft, aligned the shim by touch, not by gauge, by the pads of his fingers, feeling for a flush that only 25 years of practice could detect, and reached for the torque wrench. Maya, final torque value, primary seat. Her voice came through the speaker, cracking at the edges. 340 Newton meters. He torqued it, felt the click. Secondary. 280. Click. Axial play. 0.05. He checked the dial indicator. 0.04, within tolerance, by 1/100th of a millimeter, by a margin thinner than a whisper. Des looked up at Janet, who was standing at the top of the staircase, both hands gripping the railing, glasses pushed up on her head. "Bring it up," he said. Janet gave the signal. The turbine control operator pushed the throttle forward. The RPMs climbed. 1,000, 2,000, 2,800, 3,000, 3,450, full speed. 2 seconds of silence. Every person on that floor held their breath. Pete's knuckles were white around the rig light. Janet's fingers dented the railing. Even Richard Cole, 700 miles away on a screen in Cleveland, leaned forward in his chair. The vibration reading on the overhead monitor began to drop. 11.2 millimeters per second. 7.4. 4.6. 1.1. 0.8. Within tolerance. Well within tolerance. The temperature gauge, which had been climbing for the last hour like a countdown to catastrophe, stopped, held, then slowly began to reverse. The rolling line hummed back to life, the sound of a mill working the way it was supposed to work, the sound of steel being made, the sound of 1,200 jobs not disappearing. No one applauded. There was no cheer. Just a silence so total that you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. And then, from somewhere on the mezzanine, one voice, the voice of the worker who had said, "Dirty black mechanic" 60 minutes ago, whispered, "He actually did it." Richard Cole's face filled the video screen. "Who is that man?" Janet looked down at Des, gaunt, starving, covered in carbon and sweat, standing over the turbine with a 40-year-old torch in his hand and a dead man's medallion on his toolbox. "That's the mechanic you almost didn't let in the building." But through the control room glass, someone saw something that turned relief into dread. Wade Prescott, hunched over a terminal, frantically deleting files from the procurement system. Janet was in the control room within 90 seconds. She found Wade standing at the procurement terminal, fingers moving across the keyboard with the desperate speed of a man trying to erase his own name from a crime scene. His clipboard lay on the floor. He hadn't noticed he'd dropped it. 28 years of carrying it, and he'd finally let it go. Not with dignity, but with panic. "Step away from that terminal." Wade didn't turn around. "I'm running routine maintenance on the..." "Step away." He turned. His face was gray, the color of concrete, the color of a man who knew it was over but couldn't stop moving because stopping meant accepting. Janet called IT. The answer came in under a minute. All procurement files were backed up on corporate servers in Cleveland. Whatever Wade had deleted locally still existed. Every purchase order, every supplier invoice, every signature, every dollar that went where it shouldn't have gone. The digital trail was a perfect copy of the paper trail Des had spotted on page 6, except the digital version couldn't be burned, shredded, or explained away. Richard Cole, still watching from the video screen, spoke with the flat precision of a man who had already contacted legal. "Wade Prescott is suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will escort him from the building." Wade tried one last move. He turned to the camera, to Cole, to the record, to whatever audience might someday see this, and said, "That man performed unauthorized repairs on critical infrastructure. He voided the plant's insurance policy. Every dollar of liability is on your head, Cole." A voice came from the doorway. "No, it isn't." Pete Holloway, standing in the control room entrance with his phone held up, screen facing outward, recording. "I've got everything," Pete said. His voice was steady, the steadiest it had been all day. "From the moment he walked in, everything. The dirty black mechanic line on the mezzanine, the air freshener, the laughter, all 30 men captured in surround sound. Wade blocking the corridor, Wade pulling the assistants on a fake fire watch order, Wade calling security to remove the one man who could save the plant. And then, the repair itself. Des alone in the turbine bay, the oscilloscope proof, the micro-weld on a spinning shaft, the 4-minute finish, the vibration dropping to 0.8. All of it, every second. Filmed by a 58-year-old welder who had spent 30 years keeping his head down and had finally, in the last hour of the worst day of his career, decided to lift it. The video traveled fast. Pete sent it to the union representative that afternoon. The union rep sent it to a reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that evening. The Post-Gazette published it online the next morning with a headline that wrote itself. By noon, it was on YouTube. By that night, it was on CNN, MS, NBC, and Fox. One of those rare stories that every side of the aisle could agree was outrageous. The story was irresistible because it was everything the American public already believed and feared about the workplace, compressed into 60 minutes of footage. A homeless black mechanic, living in his van, paying off his dead wife's cancer bills with money he earned one emergency at a time. Called dirty, called beggar, laughed at by 30 men, nearly thrown out by a corrupt engineer who had caused the very crisis he couldn't solve. And then, with no help, no food in his stomach, and a 40-year-old handmade torch, he fixed what no one else could. He saved 1,200 jobs. He saved $100 million. And he did it in the final minutes, because the man who mocked him had stolen the rest. Wade Prescott was fired within the week. The internal investigation uncovered the full scope of the kickback scheme. $40,000 skimmed across 6 purchase orders over 5 months, routed through a shell supplier that existed only on paper. Federal prosecutors opened a case. On cable news, an anchor read a quote from an anonymous Braddock steelworker. The quote was simple, and it would become the most shared line of the entire story. We laughed at the one man who was trying to save us. 3 weeks later, the Braddock steel mill was running at full capacity. The turbine's vibration held steady at 0.7 millimeters per second, better than it had been in years. The blast furnace was hot. The rolling line was moving. The parking lot was full. And in the plant manager's office, Janet Moore sat across from Desmond Monroe and offered him something no one had ever offered him before. Chief Reliability Engineer, she said. New position. Created for you. Full salary, full benefits, full authority over every piece of critical machinery in this facility. You answer to me, and no one else. Des sat in a chair that was too clean for his coveralls. He hadn't changed clothes. He didn't own anything else. The red toolbox was on the floor beside him, the St. Barbara medallion catching the overhead light the way it always did, as if Howard Monroe was in the room, listening. Des didn't answer immediately. He looked at the toolbox, looked at Janet. Then he spoke. I'll take it. One condition. Name it. 2 apprenticeship slots, every year. Kids from Braddock, Homestead, Rankin. The towns this mill forgot. The ones with no connections, no degrees, no family in the union. Underserved communities. You teach them on the floor, the way my father was taught. The way I was taught. Janet nodded. Done. Put it in writing. I will. There was a pause, the kind of pause that separates one chapter of a life from another. Then Janet opened a drawer and pulled out a company check, the payment for Des's emergency repair. The amount was generous, more money than Des had seen in 2 years, more money than he had seen since Ruth was alive. Where do you want this deposited? Janet asked. I'll need your bank details. Des reached into the chest pocket of his coveralls, the pocket that didn't have a hole, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had been folded so many times that the creases were soft as fabric. He had carried it every day since the hospital mailed it, through every job, every night in the van, every morning of counting quarters. He unfolded it slowly, smoothed it on Janet's desk with both oil-stained hands, and slid it across. It wasn't a bank account number. It was a hospital invoice. Ruth Monroe, Braddock General Hospital, Oncology Department. Date of service, March through May, 2 years prior. Total outstanding balance, $184,000. Pay this first, Des said. 2 words, 3 syllables. The quietest sentence in the story, and the loudest thing he had ever said. Janet looked at the number, then she looked at Des, at the duct-taped knees, the wire-tied boots, the hands that would never be clean, the cheekbones that told you exactly how many meals he had been skipping, at the man who had just saved her plant, her career, and 1,200 families, and whose first and only request was to settle a dead woman's medical debt so he could stop carrying her invoice in his pocket like a wound that wouldn't close. For the first time in the story, Janet Moore cried. She didn't make a sound. She just removed her glasses, pressed her fingers to her eyes, and let the tears come, quickly, silently, the way people cry when they realize they've been standing next to a tragedy and didn't notice until it introduced itself. Then she put her glasses back on and picked up the phone. The company paid the full amount by the end of the week, $184,000. Cleared. The invoice that had followed Des through 2 years of grief, hunger, and wire-tied boots. Gone. Paid by the same mill that had laughed at him 3 weeks ago. Maya came to the plant on a Saturday. She had driven from Carnegie Mellon after seeing her father's name in the news. Not the viral video, which she hadn't watched yet, but a small article in the Post-Gazette that mentioned freelance mechanic Desmond Monroe as the man who prevented the Braddock steel shutdown. She found him in his new office. It was small, a converted storage room with a metal desk, a phone, and a window that looked out over the turbine bay. His name was on the door. Desmond Monroe, Chief Reliability Engineer, printed on a plastic placard that still smelled like the label maker. Dad, she stood in the doorway. You have an office. Des smiled, the kind of smile that holds back a flood. Apparently. Maya walked in. She looked around the way you look around a place that doesn't match the story you've been told. Her eyes found the red toolbox in the corner, the St. Barbara medallion gleaming. She knelt beside it and touched the medallion the same way Des always did. 2 fingers, gentle, like greeting someone you love. You're not going to use this anymore? Every day, Des said. That's where the real work happens. Then Maya saw the keys on his desk. A Ford keyring, the E250 logo on the fob. She picked them up, turned them over. And in that moment, the way a crack spreads across glass before the whole thing shatters, she understood. Dad, her voice changed. These are van keys. Des said nothing. His face didn't move, but his hands, those oil-black, cracked, permanent stained hands, gripped the edge of the desk. The van. The one you said was your work truck. Maya's hands were shaking now. Is that where... Maya, is that where you've been living? Silence. The longest silence in the story. Longer than the 2 seconds before the turbine restarted, longer than the pause before Des said, Page 6. This was a silence that carried 2 years of lies told out of love. 2 years of diner counter video calls, 2 years of a father choosing hunger so his daughter could choose her future. Maya sat down on the floor of the office, not in a chair, on the floor. She pulled her knees up and pressed her face into them and cried in a way that Des had heard only once before, at Ruth's funeral. The sound of a person discovering a grief they didn't know they were carrying. Des knelt beside her, put his arms around her. His oil-stained hands, the hands 30 men had called dirty, held his daughter the way they held the toolbox, like something sacred, like the last thing worth holding. "You never missed a tuition payment," he said. "That's all that mattered." "Dad, you were starving." "You were studying. That mattered more." They stayed like that for a long time. The turbine hummed below them. The mill worked around them. And for the first time in 2 years, Desmond Monroe was holding the only person who had ever known exactly who he was, and who now, finally, knew everything. The following Friday, Pete Holloway organized a small ceremony on the factory floor. No speeches from management, no corporate PR, just Pete, a folding table, a sheet cake from the supermarket, and every worker on the day shift standing in a loose circle. They came to Des one at a time. Handshakes, some clumsy, some firm, some accompanied by words that had clearly been rehearsed in a bathroom mirror that morning and still came out sideways. The man who had sprayed air freshener said, "I was an idiot. I'm sorry." Colton, who had hollered about the trash can, said, "You didn't owe us anything, but you saved us anyway." The last man in line was the one who started it all. The worker from the cold open, the first voice, the first cruelty. The man who had announced to 30 colleagues that dirty black mechanics didn't belong on his floor. He stood in front of Des for a long time, jaw tight, eyes wet. His hands hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. The hands of a man who had never learned how to apologize because he had never needed to, until now. "I didn't just laugh," he said, his voice cracked. "I started it. I said the words, and you saved my job anyway." Des looked at him, not with triumph, not with resentment, with something that looked impossibly like understanding. Like a man who knew that cruelty is often just fear wearing a louder shirt. He extended his hand, the oil-black, cracked, permanent-stained hand that had held the torch, turned the wrench, and kept the mill alive. "Then let's build something better." They shook hands, and the floor, the same floor that had roared with laughter 60 minutes before the shutdown, was completely, reverently silent. That week, Kreutzer Energie, the German manufacturer of the turbine, contacted Des directly. They had seen the video. They wanted him on their Global Field Service Advisory Board. He would be the first American member. The first without a formal degree. They didn't care about his credentials. They cared that he could hear a shaft sing. Richard Cole flew in from Cleveland, not for a photo opportunity, not for damage control, to sit in Des's small office and offer a consulting contract across 8 plants nationwide, on Des's terms, on Des's schedule. Des agreed to all of it. Then he drove away from the plant in the E250, the same van he'd slept in, but which now felt less like a coffin and more like a chrysalis, something he'd survived, something he'd outgrown. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Monroe, the White House Office of Science and Technology would like to speak with you regarding a National Skilled Trades Initiative. Please call at your earliest convenience." Des looked at the text, then at the red toolbox on the passenger seat, then at the St. Barbara medallion catching the last of the afternoon sun through the cracked windshield. He almost laughed. Almost. The mechanic they called Dirty had just been invited to the cleanest house in America. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Desmond Monroe stood in a high school gymnasium in Braddock, Pennsylvania. The bleachers had been folded up against the walls. 50 metal chairs were arranged in rows on the polished floor. In every chair sat a teenager, some in hoodies, some in hand-me-downs, some in clothes that looked like they'd been ironed that morning by a grandmother who understood that today was important. Behind Des, a banner hung from the basketball hoop. Monroe Trades Initiative, First Class. On the folding table in front of him sat the red toolbox. Open. The St. Barbara medallion caught the gymnasium light and threw a small, bright circle on the ceiling, like a second sun. The tools inside were arranged the same way they had always been, the way Howard Monroe had arranged them 40 years ago. Wrench on the left, dial indicator in the center, the hand-bent TIG torch in the bottom compartment. Waiting. Des looked at the 50 faces looking back at him, some eager, some skeptical. Some already building walls against disappointment because hoping had burned them before. He knew every one of those expressions. He had worn them all. He didn't start with the version the news told. He didn't start with the triumph. He started with the truth. 6 months ago, I walked into a steel mill to fix a turbine. I was living in my van. I hadn't eaten since the day before. My boots were held together with wire, and the first thing I heard, the very first thing, was a man's voice saying loud enough for 30 people to hear that they don't let dirty black mechanics on the floor. He paused, let the words settle into the gymnasium like a stone into still water, and the whole room laughed. No one in the gymnasium moved, not a cough, not a shifted chair. I want to tell you I stood tall, that I said something brave, that I didn't feel it. Des shook his head slowly. I felt it, every word, every laugh, and when they all laughed, all 30 of them at once, like I was nothing, I almost turned around and walked right back to my van, almost drove away on $11 of gas and never looked back. A girl in the second row leaned forward. Her hands were gripping the edges of her chair. A boy in the back uncrossed his arms. The kid in the front row, 14, maybe 15, oversized jacket, sneakers with a hole in the toe, hadn't blinked. But I didn't. And I want to tell you why. Des reached into the toolbox and lifted out his father's TIG torch. The hand-bent angle caught the light. The leather grip was dark with decades of use. My dad made this, Des said. Howard Monroe, steelworker, Braddock Steel, same mill. He worked there for 22 years. He died of black lung when I was 15. Des turned the torch in his hands. The room was so quiet you could hear the leather creak. He built this torch in his garage. No power. He ran the welder off a car battery. And when I asked him why he was building something nobody asked for, he said, Des stopped, swallowed. The muscles in his jaw worked. Then he continued, and his voice was steady again. The way a bridge is steady, not because it doesn't feel the weight, but because it was built to carry it. He said, the machine will talk to you, son. You just got to be quiet enough to listen. He set the torch on the table. My father never once asked for permission to be excellent. He never waited for someone to tell him he was allowed to be good at something. He just was. Quietly, every day, in a garage with no electricity and a world that never noticed. And that's what I want for every single one of you. The kid in the front row, the one with the hole in his sneaker, raised his hand. So, when they laughed at you, why didn't you leave? Des looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw the oversized jacket, the careful eyes, the sneaker with the hole. Saw himself 30 years ago. Because my dad didn't build this torch so it could sit in a van behind a scrapyard. He built it so it could do the thing it was made to do. Des paused. And so was I. And and so was he. He looked at the whole room, and so were you. At the back of the gymnasium, Maya Monroe stood behind a camera on a tripod. She was filming, not for the news, not for YouTube, but for her senior thesis at Carnegie Mellon, a documentary. She had titled it, "Quiet Enough to Listen." She was crying behind the lens, but the camera was steady, like father, like daughter, hands that shake and hold firm at the same time. The camera captured what came next. Des stepped back from the table, and 50 teenagers rose from their chairs and moved toward the open toolbox. Not rushing, not grabbing, reaching, carefully. The way you reach for something you've been told your whole life isn't meant for you, and then one day, someone opens it and says, "Go ahead." 50 pairs of hands, picking up wrenches, pliers, files, gauges, turning them over, feeling the weight. Some of them had never held a tool before. All of them were holding one now. The camera pulled wide, the banner, the toolbox, the medallion, the hands. Final text, white on black. Braddock Steel Mill has had 0 unplanned shutdowns since Desmond Monroe's intervention. The Monroe Trades Initiative has graduated 34 apprentices in its first 2 years. Wade Prescott pled guilty to procurement fraud in January 2021. Then silence. 1 beat. 2. And a single line of voiceover. Des's voice. Quiet, steady, carrying the weight of everything that came before it. They laughed because they didn't understand. He stayed because he did. If you've ever been the person no one believed in, the one they looked past, laughed at, counted out, share this story. And if you know a Des, someone out there working harder than anyone sees, staying quiet when the world is loud, tell them something today. Tell them, we see you.